So we are continuing on the prophets. Really, kind of, we're continuing on the prophets. What we are trying to do is look into discovering a prophetic voice in you, in our churches, in our culture, and we are trying to find that alternative voice. That's the goal of this. And we're doing that by looking at the prophets. So it's a both and. And then we also recognize that as the prophetic story is told through Israel, we come to this moment at sort of the end of the line, but really just the beginning, when Jesus claims to be part of that prophetic tradition and is fully embraced in that prophetic tradition. And so we are constantly reminded that if it's our call, in fact, to follow Jesus, to imitate Jesus, then our call is to discover our own prophetic voices as part of that purpose and part of that process. So I just want to remind you up front that that's what we're doing and that's what we're searching for. So here's where we've been. And part of the difficulty, because I know you open up the prophets, or you don't, but you open up the prophets and you go, man, this is complicated, and it's difficult to understand because it's lots of poetry with words that we don't use. It's often references to things that you have to have like a broader historical understanding of what's happening in Israel to get. So if you're reading it in the day, you understand it fully because it all makes sense. You know, if I reference Trump today, you all get it. If I reference Trump 100 years from now, you know, what's Trump, right? Because we will all forget about this period in our history. But that's what makes it complicated, and that's part of what makes it difficult. So the Bible, as we've compiled it together, has put all of these pieces in one place as if to say these are all part of the same story. And they are, but they come from different moments in the history of Israel. They come from different locations in Israel, which tells a different story and requires you to have sort of that geographical knowledge. So it gets complicated from time to time. So we're just looking at a few of them along the way in this process and attempting to say, how do we get some basic understanding about this broadness of what's happening here? Who are they? Why are they speaking an alternate voice? And what do we take from it? Where do we go from here? One thing that I want us to remember, and this morning we're going to look at one of my favorite stories. Maybe because the Hebrew is really nice and easy to read and understand, but that's another issue. But really, it's just a great story. It's fun and it's exciting and it moves and it has purpose and everything like that. We'll get to that later. But these prophets come in different places. So we've looked at some from the exile. So if we remember, most of these prophets center around specific moments in Israel's history. So first, Israel is overtaken. Well, we have the kings. Israel comes, said, we need a king. They create a kingdom. We have a line of kings. And then most of their history is told by people or peoples that are taking over their nation, Israel and Judah. And so these different moments in history when they are in extreme stress, in extreme suffering and pain and oppression, we hear the voices of the prophets often centered around those moments. So we also hear, before those moments come, when a prophet says to the king, listen, you really got to get your act together. Because here comes the Assyrians, or here comes the Babylonians, and if you don't figure out what's going on and right your path, you're going to end up overtaken as a punishment by God. That's a theological question we have to wrestle with here. But they are constantly providing that alternative voice to a kingdom that says, we have the power, we have the control. Here is God, here's how you worship, here's what it looks like. This morning, we're going to look at Jonah. What's interesting about Jonah, as we look at these stories, is that Jonah is mixed in here with these prophets, but Jonah isn't telling his story. Someone else is telling Jonah's story, right? We're familiar with Jonah. It's like, he gets eaten by a big fish, and we're not sure if it's a whale or a fish, or if it's metaphorical, or if it really happened, and like, what's the fish that could have eaten Jonah that size? And then he comes out, and he gets spewed up on the land, and then he goes and does what God asks him. That's Jonah, right? So, this story of Jonah comes at a time, or at least as his story is told, he comes into a time before the Assyrians have come to take over the kingdom. Now, they're still bad people. They're still Israel's enemies. And the first thing that happens in the story of Jonah is God calls Jonah to go to Nineveh, which is a big, great city of Assyria. Now, we know the story. Jonah says no. And he gets on a ship and he goes in the opposite direction. Now, here's what's great about this. This is a story. You should experience this like J.K. Rowling or whatever books you read. I don't do a lot of fiction stuff. I'm too whatever. You should experience this like a story. It is a narrative. We're going to do stories later, and I keep telling you that and telling you a great story, and then I say, well, we're going to do stories at some point. Just tell stories. This is a great story. On the scene comes Jonah, and it's just like every other God's calling story. The prophet is called by God, and Jonah is supposed to say, yes, Lord, here I am. Or he's supposed to say no, and then yes. But he's supposed to respond to God's call. And instead, Jonah gets on a ship, and you expect it to say, toward Nineveh. And instead, the ship is going away from Nineveh. It is going in the opposite direction. And Jonah is specifically ignoring God's call. We tell this story in a number of ways. We like to make it personal. So let's make it a little bit personal. Maybe you've heard this story and they say, and Jonah just wasn't obedient. Are you being obedient to God? Are you listening? Or are you being selfish? This isn't about being selfish. Or maybe the statement is, Jonah was afraid to go to this big, scary Assyrian city. Are you letting your fears get to you? But this isn't about fear either. This is about a theological inconsistency with how Jonah experiences the world. See, we get the idea that Jonah's actually a good guy. Actually, he's living in Israel, and he's speaking the alternative voice to Israel. He's probably the prophet telling them, look, everything looks bad, but we have to trust in God, and God's going to bring this back to the right place, and we're going to turn this ship around. He's probably doing all the right things. The problem in this moment is not that he's scared. It's not that he's selfish. It's that theologically, Israel is special. And the Assyrians don't deserve the information he's supposed to give them. Now let's make this personal. Theologically, we're often comfortable talking about ourselves and the bad we've done and how great God is to bring us up out of these harsh places. Yet often not also giving someone the humble response that God loves them to. Or, well, that may not count in that whole thing. I've done some bad things, but this seems different. We wouldn't tell them that. We would just think that in our heads, right? We don't say that to somebody. It's a joke. Laugh with me. It's funny. We have these voices in our head. Sometimes I entertain myself. Many of you found that out this week. The point is that we reserve how we share God's story and God's love in this narrative. This is a story, and every Israelite reading this narrative would have fully, maybe an overstatement, fully agreed with Jonah's decision. This people is a terrible people that do not deserve the message of God's mercy and love that he's supposed to bring to them. Now, this is what's interesting as the story goes along, is that interestingly, God has told him to go to Nineveh and tell them that God's going to destroy the city because of their evil ways. God hasn't told him, go tell the people of Nineveh to repent so that I don't destroy them. But see, Jonah has this internal conflict. On the one hand, he knows they shouldn't deserve this. On the other hand, he knows that God is loving and merciful and all kind and will forgive them and offer that love and mercy. And so he doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to give them that message. This is a theological debate in Jonah's head about what he's supposed to do. Now, you should read the story because we're not going to do all of it today. You should read the story, and when you do, approach it like a story. This is a narrative. It's exciting. Things move, and the sea starts to storm, and there's this great catastrophe that's occurring, and the people on the boat don't know what to do, and so they all cry out to their God. Equality is the key here. You cry out to your God. You cry out to your God. We have to figure out how to do this. It doesn't fix anything, and so they cast lots. Say, whose fault is this? Now, I don't believe this works today, but it worked. And turns out the lots fell on Jonah, and Jonah said, yep, that's me. Actually, I was supposed to do something. I angered God. This is my fault. Now, let's not do all the theological stuff about God, like sending a storm to mess with Jonah and his ship. But they throw him overboard. He says, you have to. This is movie-worthy. We should make a movie, right? This is great. So they throw him overboard, and then the fish, and they spew him out. He spends time in the fish. There's this beautiful poem in the midst of this. It doesn't really make sense because Jonah hasn't done anything to change his mind. He's still has this anger toward God, and it's going to continue. You see, we react and respond with fear. So maybe we call this a little bit of fear. We respond and react with fear when our understanding of God is expanded beyond what we've given room for. So we say God can do anything, and we set boundaries. Well, God can do anything as long as we do X, Y, and Z. God can do anything, within the framework of the space-time continuum. God can do anything. We set these boundaries. So when Jonah's boundaries were blown out of the water, because God said to him, go to this city, this terrible city that you are enemies with, that are terrible people, and tell them who I am and what I do, Jonah can't handle it. And the same thing occurs in ourselves when our limits to God are expanded beyond what we can handle. A few years ago, I'm going to tell another story. A few years ago, Rob Bell. Now, you can do whatever you want with Rob Bell at the end of this story. That's your business. Bell is often a four-letter word in Christian circles. That's fine. It's a four-letter word in any circle, but you know what I mean. Bell wrote a book that scared people because he's asking the question, how great is God's love? It's called Love Wins. If you want to challenge yourself, you can read it. in this book, he says, maybe God's love is bigger than we thought. Maybe God's love expands beyond what we can comprehend. Now, the point of the story is not to tell you to believe what Rob Bell says or not. The point of the story is to say, here's what happens next. It was too big. It was too grandiose. It was too expansive. And so Bell starts receiving huge amounts of hate mail, huge amounts of backlash from the Christian community saying, how could he say this? God is justice and love, and goes on and on and on. To this day, that Bell is still a four-letter word in most Christian circles. The point is not the theology. The point is that when we expand our understanding of God to a point that it bursts those boundaries, we get scared and we get on a ship and we go in the opposite direction. And that's what happened to Jonah. I want to look at chapter 4 here in Jonah. And what happens here is that we finally get a sense of the alternative voice that this author is giving us. See, up until now, Jonah has done everything that he is supposed to do as a good Israelite prophet. He has rejected the idea that Nineveh could possibly be saved. He has rejected the idea that Israel is not a special people. And God calls him out. So we're going to look at chapter 4 here. And what's happened is Jonah has finally changed direction. He's gone to Nineveh. He's done exactly what he's been asked to do, which is tell them that God is going to destroy you because you're bad people. And after he's done this, he goes up on a hill beside the city and he sits down and waits. He waits to revel in the destruction of Nineveh. When God saw what, this is the end of 3, when God saw what they did, how they turned from their evil ways, God changed his mind about the calamity that he had said he would bring upon them, and he did not do it. But this was very displeasing to Jonah, and he became angry, and he prayed to the Lord. He said, "O Lord, is not this what I said while I was still in my own country? That is why I fled to Tarshish at the beginning. For I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. And now, O Lord, please take my life, because it is better for me to die than to live." That's how much hate and anger he had built up about the Assyrian people. Sat down east of the city. He made a booth of himself there, and he sat under the shade waiting to see what would become of the city. And so at this point, we get an object lesson from God, from the author, who's saying, Jonah, this typical, appropriate, good person and prophet of God, man of God, depending on which word is being used for prophet, literally, man of God, called by God, has done everything that you would expect him to do, and now we're going to get an object lesson about a bush. And God raises this bush up to give him some shade, and then God brings a worm to eat it, and it withered. And Jonah again repeated his statement, "It is better for me to die than to live." And God says to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be concerned about this bush? You are concerned about a bush. I am concerned about a people. You didn't create the bush. You didn't grow the bush. You didn't bring it to its place. should I not also be concerned about Nineveh, this great city with many, many people? You see, in that moment, the author has brought to us a truly prophetic word. Jonah had delivered prophetic words to Israel. But the idea, the notion that you would expand that beyond Israel is too big for him. And if you're reading this like a story, you get to that moment and you go, oh my goodness, I can't believe God did that. He just let all of those terrible people live. Everything that was supposed to happen didn't. And God is bigger than I ever understood. That's how it was read and understood. And at some point, we hit those moments ourselves. At some point, when our prophetic voice, our alternative voice to the culture, to life, to our churches sometimes, comes to bear on the world and says, I had no idea how big God was. I had no idea how great God's love is. And it changes the way we live and breathe and think about God.